It is March of 1945. Over the Pacific Ocean, a squadron of Hellcats roars towards a coastal Japanese airfield. With rockets armed, their assignment is clear: to destroy any aircraft possible and suppress Japanese air power before the invasion of Okinawa begins. Meanwhile, however, 500 miles away, a single Japanese bomber heads to execute an attack on the very fleet that these Hellcats came from. The attack on the airfield will be intense, and the attack on the American fleet will be one of the deadliest losses of the war for the U.S. Navy. This is quite a day for a pilot's very first mission. But today, Don McPherson, one of the F6F Navy Hellcat pilots who flew this sortie to begin his combat tour, tells the story himself. Let's dive into the records, hear the history, and relive the mission.
Bombing of Honolulu as the Japanese, in their stroke of treachery, attacked the city. This is the Waikiki residential section, famed for beauty in the paradise of the Pacific. Vandal havoc wrought by the Japanese bombers. At the upper part of the screen, there you can see them. The people are bewildered by the blow without warning.
That evening, we heard on the radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. You know, we knew that America was going to be in a war. I'd made up my mind, definitely, I wasn't going to wait for the drafts. You know, I wanted to decide on my own what branch of the service that I served in. And there was no doubt in my mind that it was going to be Navy.
And with that, he was off, headed to join the U.S. Navy pilot training and leaving behind his family and even postponing his planned marriage so that he could fight for his country. Meanwhile, though, things were beginning to heat up in the Pacific.
In the South Pacific, Allied forces are pressing onward in the battle for the crucial airstrips of the Japanese-held islands. And both sides know that control of the air will likely decide the fate of this war. American forces are leading the charge here, taking the Marianas Islands in their latest stretch of triumphs. To continue this task, it will take every American working hard and giving his utmost so the boys on the beaches and in their cockpits can see us through to victory.
Don was hungry to join the fight, and the first step would be passing flight school. But in this time, even training could be a hazardous endeavor.
I'll tell you, I need to tell you one thing that was a little bit exciting that happened there. I was up with an instructor one day, and he was teaching me how to do spins and how to recover from spins. He did several of them, and then he told me, now he says, now you do one. He says, pull the nose up until it stalls out and let it fall off, rotate 2.5 turns, and then dump the stick forward and kick opposite rudder and pop it out of the spin. So I did. I pulled it up and it stalled okay, and then I don't know for sure whether I did quite 2.5 turns, but anyway, when I thought it was proper time, I popped the stick forward and applied opposite rudder and popped that thing out of the spin, and when it came out of the spin, it just sounded like a shotgun went off. It just a big explosion, and it started vibrating like crazy, and of course, that was in a Taylor cross, so the wing was above you. It went across above you, you know. And boy, that old wing was just shaking like crazy, and we were losing altitude. And the instructor then, he says, let me have the controls. And he said, you better buckle your parachute on, because we might have to leave this crate, is what he called it. And so I was buckling on him. He was using full throttle then, and by that time he got to where we wasn't losing altitude too fast, and so he said, well, I think we're about 4 miles from the runway, and I think we've got just enough altitude to make the runway. And he says, is that okay? I says, well, that's fine. So that's the way it worked out. We just made the end of the runway, and when we landed and taxied up and stopped, then the plexiglass windshield come up in front of you and bent over the top of the the wing and was fastened with sheet metal screws. And I popped all of those sheet metal screws loose, and so that windshield was vibrating was what was making it look like the wing was going to come off. So they put bigger screws in it, and it was fine, and they continued to fly it.
In the following weeks, things would go smoother. After passing advanced flight training and learning how to fly like a naval aviator, Don was finally moved up to a real fighter, the brand new F6F Hellcat.
I was so pleased that I got to fly the Hellcat because I had heard so much about it, and it sure didn't disappoint me. That old 2,000 horsepower, had plenty of power. It was very maneuverable. It could turn tight in a dogfight. It was a very durable airplane. I've seen some of them come back with quite a bit of the wing shot away, and they still fly. It just was a very easy airplane to fly. When you've been in flight training and had a flight instructor to teach you all these things, it's different when you get to the Hellcat, there's just one seat, so how do you learn to fly it? Well, actually what they did, they gave us time in the cockpit to memorize all the controls and the gauges and so forth. And then you had to pass a blindfold checkout. They'd blindfold you, and you were supposed to be able to point at any instrument that they called out. And don't misunderstand me, there's tons of toggles and switches and so forth, and you didn't have to identify them, but you had to identify the ones that you really had to use when you were in flight. And once you could do that, why then you just got in and flew it.
Now that he was ready for combat, right on cue, Don McPherson was ordered overseas. This meant that it was time to say goodbye to both his family and to his newlywed wife. By this time, in early 1945, as Don headed to Pearl, the U.S. Navy in the Pacific had gained ground and was pushing closer to mainland Japan.
The battle is reaching its climax for the control of the Pacific. Currently, brave Americans are fighting tooth and nail for every stretch of sand on the valuable island of Iwo Jima. Here, the Japanese are dug in hard to their last fortress, Mount Suribachi, and are trying to hold off the Allied bombardment. The Americans, though, know that the airstrips on this island are crucial for their air campaign and must take it to hit mainland Japan. This will not be without cost, however, as American forces are taking a beating, and the rising sun will not be brought down without a fight.
As Don inched closer to the front lines with every day, the realness of the war hit him far sooner than expected.
Everything looked normal until we got to the entrance of the channel going into Pearl Harbor. And then it would really hit you to like somebody hitting your face, about wow. I've read about this, but, it doesn't do it justice. It just utter destruction, on both sides all the way in. And, of course, then still in the harbor itself, there were the indications, of blown ships and so forth, and so it really brought home to us, what that war was going to be like.
As Don arrived and settled in at Pearl Harbor, he continued to fly and train with his fellow replacement pilots, and expected to be sent off with them in just a few weeks' time to trade off with a unit that needed relief. However, war is a chaotic place, and things rarely go as expected.
This Air Group 83 had formed on the East Coast as a total unit, and then they transported them to Maui to finish their training, and they had lost a pilot in carrier landings, and so they needed a replacement. Somehow my name come up, and they transported me over there. And when I got there, I found out that Air Group 83 was all packed, ready to leave for combat the next day. So I didn't get to know any of the guys. I didn't get to fly with them or anything.
Ensign Don McPherson was now headed to war with a brand new unit, Fighter Squadron 83. This unit, with their F6F Hellcats, had been assigned to relieve the fighter squadron from the USS Essex, a carrier that had quickly started to build a name for herself. She was currently the pride of Task Force 58, what was known as the Fast Carrier Task Force, and what a force this was.
That took us then to Ulithi Harbor, which is in the Caroline Islands, and that's where the Fast Carrier Task Force was anchored. And wow, did we get a surprise. I mean, we just didn't realize how huge our fleet was at that point. There was ships anchored as far as you could see. And, after Pearl Harbor, we couldn't realize that we could recover that fast.
Ulithi. Not too long ago, these protected waters were filled with the Imperial Japanese Navy. Now it was America's secret weapon of the Pacific War, an anchorage large enough to hold the most powerful armada of warships in history.
These aircraft, ships, and carriers would play a crucial role in the battle for the Pacific in the coming weeks. And now, right at the center of it was Don McPherson and Fighter Squadron 83.
Well, they put us aboard. We got kind of halfway settled, and that night, after chow, they told us that we're going to show a movie on the hangar deck, tonight if you're interested. And so we thought, well, that's a good way to relax, So we went down and watched this movie. I don't remember what the movie was anymore, but anyway, about halfway through the movie, General Quarters sounded. And boy, the ship's people, they had jumped up and they started running, for their gun mounts and their stations, and then he was knocking some chairs down and stuff. We were standing there looking at each other. We didn't know what we were supposed to do. But they finally announced on the PA system that flight officers were supposed to go to the mess hall, and the officers' mess hall. And so by that time, while the raid was pretty much over, we found out immediately what the kamikaze suicide corps of the Japanese was all about. There had been 2 twin-engine bombers come in, and one of them made a run on the Essex, but he overshot and tore the antennas, some of them off the top of our ship, and crashed on the island. And the other one hit a crashing blow on the carrier that was anchored next to us. But apparently it must not have done a terrible lot of damage, because I know that they left with us the next day when we headed for combat.
Around this time, on the radio, the U.S. sailors heard the news that the battle for Iwo Jima had officially been won.
Iwo Jima, only 450 miles from Japan. The full power of the American Pacific fleets, of land, sea, and air forces, tirelessly rehearsed in combat through scores of swift amphibious invasions, struck a semi-final blow. The Japanese dead ran into the hundreds of thousands, and once again a flag of liberty was dramatically run up.
Little did they know that this was major news for the Fast Carrier Task Force. This now meant that their entire group was to be ordered to sail out and support the next battleground, the planned invasion of Okinawa. This would be the next step in securing a foothold to attack the Japanese mainland. But for the time being, Don, the new guy, was not actually a part of a flight yet, simply an extra pilot.
So the next day the whole fleet started out for combat, and I was an extra pilot at that point. And so I was flying combat air patrol over the fleet for a few days. Well, the air group, they have pilots divided into divisions of 4, and of course you have call sign, a call name. This division called Wonder 5 took off one morning in the dark. It had rained during the night, so the deck was wet, and number 2 guy in the division let his Hellcat get away from it and went off the side into the ocean. Sometimes they don't survive that. Sometimes they get sucked in underneath the ship, but he got out of it. And a couple days later, he did the same thing. And he survived that one. Well, they decided that he just wasn't fit for combat, and so they grounded him, and then I took his place. And so for the next 6 months, I flew wing on the division leader of Wonder 5.
Now an official pilot in Wonder 5, Don McPherson would be flying on the wing of Carlos Soff, a skilled pilot and a respected leader. Don's job was to follow his leader and keep his tail clear, and then, if the opportunity presented itself, to also get involved in the action. It was a big responsibility, and he would take full advantage of the opportunity to fight. Soon enough, he was assigned to his very first mission with the new Wonder 5. This would be a raid to attack a key Japanese airfield in preparation for the upcoming invasion.
On the northern flank, Admiral Mark A. Mitcher's tireless Task Force 58 stepped up its aerial assault on Kyushu and the enemy home island.
The very first flight that I flew with them was a 300-mile flight to Kyushu. And we were carrying rockets and, of course, our 50-caliber machine guns and so forth. And we took off in the dark in order to get them out of bed. And we were successful in doing it. When we got to Nitagahara Airfield in Kyushu, we could see people running to anti-aircraft guns, and pilots running to their airplanes, ready to take off. Well, there were no, being we got them out of bed, there were no airborne aircraft that we needed to be concerned about. And so we started picking out targets of opportunity on the ground.
As Don begins his first attack on the Japanese targets, there is an important note on this very first mission of Fighter Squadron 83 that puts into perspective just how intense the battle was becoming for the Fast Carrier Task Force. And we can see it here in his logbook. While Don and the rest of the Hellcats from the USS Essex were making their runs at Kyushu, the USS Franklin, another Essex-class fast carrier, was launching a similar attack. Her strike, however, instead of Kyushu, was on the Japanese mainland at Honshu. During this attack and the other attack of Kyushu by VF-83, one single Japanese dive bomber snuck past radar undetected and began an attack on the USS Franklin.
At 3 minutes before 7 on March 19th, less than 100 miles from Honshu, the Franklin's planes took off into a heavily overcast sky. We were making 24 knots. A sixth of the crew was at breakfast when we got a message from the Hancock that they saw a twin-engine Jap medium bomber. Our plane started looking for him, but he slipped down out of a cloud and laid 2 500-pound bombs on our flight deck. 45 of our planes were aloft, but there were 31 on the flight deck and 22 on the hangar deck, fully gassed and armed. The first heavy vapor explosion enveloped the stern in flames. We turned into the wind to keep the fire and smoke astern. The Jap bomber had pulled up from his bomb run and was streaking for home when the leader of Air Group 5 got him and shot him down. The plight of the Franklin was probably best described by one of our returning flyers.
I was with the 1st Squadron. Just before we got over the target, my oil line let go, so I had to nurse a crippled plane back home. I tried to stay in the clouds because I couldn't outfly a Seacoast. When I broke through the overcast, I saw flames shoot hundreds of feet above the Franklin, and a 2,000-foot column of smoke. It looked awful bad, but she still had some headway. I got permission for an emergency landing on the Hancock.
The fire raged as bombs, rockets, and small caliber ammunition continued to explode with increasing violence.
This would become one of the most deadly attacks in the war for the U.S. Navy, and over 900 sailors were lost. It happened so fast and was so deadly that many initially assumed that this was a kamikaze. But later records and damage reports showed that it was likely a Japanese bomber, which in this newsreel was correctly called a Judy, although incorrectly shown as a Betty. It was a devastating loss for the U.S. Navy and for the Fast Carrier Task Force. But meanwhile, the battle raged on, and 500 miles away, the attack on Kyushu was just getting started.
We would always make our attacks in a steep dive because you get up to 400 knots speed, and then when you pulled out, when normally they would shoot behind you, they wouldn't give you enough deflection. So I picked out a big twin-engine bomber that was called a Betty. They had given us nicknames for all of the Japanese aircraft so that we didn't have to memorize those Japanese names. And so this Betty bomber was sitting there on the tarmac, and so I fired my rocket at it and I started strafing it too with my machine guns, and when I saw it blow up, then I had to pull out pretty fast because I was getting pretty low, and when I pulled out, my engine quit. Well, normally they're shooting behind you, but after the engine quitting, why, of course, then I could see tracers crossing in front of me. They were leading me too much. Well, losing speed, but it's not real serious, with the engines stalling that way, because the propeller with the speed keeps rotating, so it's cranking the engine. All you need to do is get gas to it. So I grabbed it. It had an auxiliary gas pump with a handle on it inside the cockpit, and I started pumping gas to it. And when that old 2,000 horsepower took, I got that surge, and it pulled me back into those anti-aircraft shots, and so I went home with a hole or two in my airplane that day. But I was heading toward the ocean, and pretty quick I was out of harm's way. Well, when the engine stalled, I was starting getting fumes in the cockpit, and so I rolled the hatch back, to get rid of that, and I had enough speed that the suction pulled my helmet and my earphones off my head, and it went flying off in space. So I didn't have any radio communication and so forth, but when we got out over the ocean, then we were on radio silence, so the Japanese couldn't pick up our transmission, So I made some signals to my division leader that I'd been hit, and he kind of flew down underneath me and looked over and gave me a thumbs up. He didn't see anything too serious, and so when we headed back for the carrier, then the Hellcat wasn't just quite flying right, it just didn't feel right. But I didn't have to fight it a lot, and by adjusting some trim tabs and stuff, I got it to fly so I could almost fly hands off, for at small periods of time, and got back aboard the carrier in good shape, made a good landing with it. And you have a plane captain that has your plane started most generally and ready to fly, and then usually when you land, he shows up and he'll climb up on the wing, help you unbuckle, and ask you some questions and stuff. And my guy, he called up on him and he says, "I see you picked up a little lead today." And I said, "Oh yeah, but where?" And he said, "Well, you got a hole about a foot behind your back." He said, so, well, the problem was that that projectile that went through had cut a cable to the vertical stabilizer on the tail, so I didn't have any control of that part of the tail, but it wasn't real serious, so I got back. And And I'm lucky, the luckiest guy in the world. That's the only hole I picked up in the 6 months of flying. So,
Don McPherson had officially flown his first attack mission as a member of Fighter Squadron 83. He was 1 foot away from being hit directly in the cockpit, but he had made it out, and even destroyed a Japanese Betty on the ground. In the coming days, he would be called upon to do much more, as the invasion of Okinawa began, and the Japanese Kamikaze Corps had only begun to fight. All of this, however, will be coming in part 2 of Don McPherson's story, to TJ3 History. Consider supporting me on Patreon if you enjoyed this story, and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.